So I'm here with Mr. Richard Rouse, who is the founder of Paranoid Production. Richard, how you doing?
All right.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and your studio.
I started up Paranoid Productions actually a long time ago, about 20 years ago, and I made a couple of Macintosh games. And I wanted to get onto bigger projects after that, so I went and worked at a bunch of bigger companies. Like I worked at Surreal Software, I worked on a horror franchise called The Suffering. I worked at Ubisoft. I worked at Microsoft most recently on things like State of Decay and Sunset Overdrive. But now I'm coming back to sort of where I started with doing more of an indie studio.
You've announced that you're working on an unannounced new indie project.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, the company was really founded out of my particular interest, which is finding out interesting things to do with narrative in games. You know, I've been lucky on some of the games I've worked on, like The Suffering. You were able to make moral choices about, you know, what you did in the game would affect the endings you got. So the game I'm working on now is really trying to figure out how can we make narrative even more procedural. So it's not just you making choices, though you'll be doing that too, but also the story itself sort of changing dynamically each time you play.
You used to work at a AAA studio. What made you want to go indie with your new title?
I still love AAA games, play them a lot, have a lot of friends working with that. I think they're totally cool. It can be challenging, however, to try to do really new things in that space and trying to innovate in terms of narrative or have procedural narrative in interesting ways. But just wanting to do new things, it just got to the point where it's like, I really want to try something different that's a little more experimental.
We came to the jungle looking for peace.
America is corrupt.
And because we preach the truth, they call us a cult.
Yeah, on my current project, I have a bunch of people I've worked with before, which is great. But I also have a couple of students, so I wanted to mix it up and have different people working on this to bring different viewpoints to it. So
yeah, the young bring the new potential and the new
right. And they'll suggest things of we should just do this, and I'll be like, that's crazy. Let me tell you why. And then think, oh, but wait, we could do this. So a lot of good stuff comes out of that. A lot of projects, when you start out doing them, if you knew everything you knew at the end, you never would have done that project. But some of the best games come out of that too, right? Of like, this was a totally terrible idea to make this because it took us 3 times as long as we thought, and you know, several people didn't survive the process, but we ended up with this amazing game. It was a totally bad decision to make, but we made it. Now it's cool that we made it. So I think there's a lot of advantage to new people coming into it too that way.
So when we look at your books, your articles, your talks, you're clearly somebody who has thought a lot about game development. So over the years, have you re-established and re-examined some of your previous views on your approach to game design?
Sure. I mean, it's an ever-evolving process, and the thing I find that's really interesting, and this is, you know, for someone who wants to get into games or something, they should know this, is that every studio is really different in how they work. And something that worked great at one studio with one set of people with one project will totally not work at another studio, if it's a process or a game design principle or whatever. And you need to be able to, going into a studio like that, just to be able to roll with it and absorb the culture that's there and figure out how you fit into that. You know, working as an indie now, I've come to value what producers do a lot more than I did at AAA studios. And I always had a joking love-hate relationship with producers, you know, thinking, yeah, but what do you really do on the project? But, you know, they're super important to running a project. And when you're indie, you're often acting as your own producer. You know, so your own check on how much money you're spending on a feature, your own check on like how long a feature is taking, and you have to constantly be asking yourself, is this really worth it?
Where do you hope the industry will go within the next 10 years?
Creatively, you know, I really, you know, my passion is figuring out new ways to tell stories only video games can tell, and I'm just hoping that, you know, we can do a lot more experimenting with how we're doing that and not always think, well, the story has to be this fixed thing every time.
Hold it right there, or I will cut you down! You hear me, inmate?
Give him a chance.
Kill him!
I think there's a lot of room to experiment with how the story can be different every time and really explore subject matter and real-world situations and whatever it is in ways that only video games can.
Has your phone been ringing off the hook ever since you posed for the Men of Game Development calendar?
No, that was definitely an interesting experience. There was a really interesting thread on Kotaku. It's like, these guys shouldn't be posing for these photos. Oh, this is terrible. And then one person said, except for that guy in the leather, he looks great. And I was like, what? Whoa, what? No, that was not the intention.
Screw game development, just go into modeling, you know.
Yeah, I didn't know.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for the interview.
Yeah, cool. Thanks a lot. It was great to do it.
Indie Games Level Up is produced by Handmade. Handmade creates video game trailers, commercials, and this web series. This episode is sponsored by the Montreal International Game Summit. Get to the next level with MIGS.